Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. You know, there's just something about grandmothers. I don't know of any human being, certainly in my life, that has impacted me, the man that I am right now, more so than my grandmother. And one of the reasons is I spent so much time around her. I learned so much from her, and not just from the things that she would say, but how she lived her life. She was a very simple woman, a rural woman down here in the deep South. But my Lord, there is not a single day that I don't think about her. And that's the beauty of it, because I can pass that on to my kids and to my grandkids. Maybe some of the lessons I learned just from observing her. But the sad reality is this. Once she was gone from my life, there were no more lessons to be learned. There was nothing else to be taught. Today, we're going to talk about a case involving one such woman who is now absent from her grandchildren's lives. And it's not that she passed away in her sleep. She's not even aged. I'm talking about a woman that was brutally murdered and left all alone, dead at the hands of a monster. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Dave, I think some of the first memories I have in life are of my grandmother. I'll tell you a real quick story. When I think I was like 3 or 4, we lived in an old house that was so incredibly cold. And this is before the days of central heating and air. And folks will probably identify with this. We had one of those old box metal natural gas heaters, and it had a big flat shelf on it. It had the glowing rocks inside of it. There was some kind of ceramic thing. I've actually seen generations take pots of hot or water on it and put on top of these things to kind of rehumidify the air. When I was little, got out of the bathtub and I sat on the thing, and it burned the entire backside of my leg. And I love my mother. I truly do. But, there's been kind of this family lore that goes on about this. When I was little, I wasn't screaming for my mother. I was screaming for my Pearl, which is my grandmother refused to go by the name Granny or Grandma. Her name was Pearl, and she insisted that I call her that.
Oh,
and
my
they wound up
God.
having to take me to the hospital.
Because
Because of the burn. And she was there all through the treatment. I was screaming, crying, carrying on and yelling. And, Dave, I say that because I love Grandma so much. And I think about what is absent from the life and lives of this family that we're talking about today.
All I'm thinking is, you said your granny wanted to go by Pearl and not Granny. And all
Yeah.
I was thinking is Beverly Hillbillies. Leslie Flat and Earl Scruggs. Pearl,
Yeah,
Pearl,
there you go.
Pearl, don't give your love to Earl. That's what I'm thinking. So here's what we have. Got a 57-year-old woman. A woman who, by the way, has taken care of people for her whole adult life.
Yep.
She is really dedicated to taking care of everyone at the hospital, whatever she had to do. And one thing that's really important to catch here, Joe, she was taking care of her aged father
Yes.
at the time this happened. And when I was reading the obituary, where it says, who you've left behind, and I realized that her taking care of her father in his older age, and now he has outlived her. She was able to give him so much of herself to keep him comfortable and healthy that she actually died before he did. That was a very telling thing. Jeanette Wilton was 57 years old, Michigan native. She did spend a little time in Florida during her life, but most of the time it's Michigan. And her body was found by, Joe has taught me something, friends. Look at the finder.
Yeah.
Always look at the finder. I am so suspicious of the person who finds the body. That's not a worry here, but I am concerned over something, Joe, and I'm hoping you can shed light on this, because the way this is described is 57-year-old woman is found in the Flint River near her home, or she's found near the Flint River near her home. There's a big difference being found in the river near a train trestle and on land near the river.
Yes.
And I can't figure out exactly what it is, but at 57 years old, Jeanette Wilton was found murdered.
Yeah, and you think about the deposition of remains. I love that term. You think about, where they are deposited, and that gives you a sense of who you're dealing with. I think, not to get off into the area of profiler, but let's look at it just from a common sense perspective. All right,
Yeah.
we don't have to, call in people with PhDs in behavioral science and all that sort of thing. You look at it from an investigative side.
It would be so funny if you would pick up your phone right now and call Nancy and say, Nancy, we need a lawyer.
Well, I'm going to call. Yeah, you're right. I would call.
Actually, we would call you on this one.
Yeah,
you would be the person we would call. Talk to me about Jeanette Wilton and where her body was found and how that impacts what's going to take place in the investigation.
Yeah, it will, because
it took a long time to solve this case, Joe.
It did, and you have to tie that person back to wherever they are domiciled, where they lived, right?
Yeah.
And then relative to proximity to residence, okay? You think about, well, first off, who knew that she lived where she lived? And then how do they know about the other geographic landmarks in that location? Because you got a train trestle, obviously, but you have a significant body of water here. And so if you're trying to get her to the river, all right, to put her there, or maybe you placed her in the river at some point in time and she washed ashore, what was the purpose of being in that specific location? Because here's the thing, if an individual is placed into a body of water, something happens relative to the geography, right? Particularly if you're talking about a river. They will be removed from that location, or that approximates where they may have lived, right? Mm-hmm. So you're left scratching your head. Let me ask all of our friends just a quick second here. You think about this. How many times have you ever driven across a bridge or stood on the bank of a river and you see something floating down the river, and it could be branches, any other kind of debris. It could be literally somebody has thrown a bag of garbage over a bridge and it's floating down there. You might not give it a second thought. When humans float on bodies of water like this, okay, you're not necessarily going to pay attention to it. But what does it do? Well, the river, without drawing attention to, say, somebody that's in a car that's transporting a body, and maybe they have to get out of the car, remove the body. Once you place that body in the river, it's gently just kind of floating away, or in case if you're near whitewater, it's going to rapidly move the body. But what else is going on? You're also washing the body, if you will, removing any kind of evidence that might have trace elements to it that would be of value. But Dave, it would seem in this particular case that there were trace elements that had been left behind that I believe are probably specific tiebacks to whoever the killer is in this case.
Well, the one thing that when I was looking at it, because over time you realize that not all reporters are equal in the work they do. And when you're relying on public records, because, by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, Joe, this started in February of 2003. February of 2003. As we are doing this show right now, they've just solved this crime. For 23 years, the family of Jeanette has not known who her killer was. They had no clue. Now they do, but they didn't until in the last couple of weeks. So when I'm looking back and going back through all these old reports and trying to find police reports and everything else, you're going, where was her body found? Because it means everything. And based on what we know now, there was a vicious attack that took place on this woman.
Yes.
And it was near her home. So based on that, we've got one of two things to figure out. Either she was out for a walk and it was a random attack. Somebody was following her, watching after her. She's a 57-year-old woman. Was it a robbery that went bad and had to end in a murder? I mean, I don't know. All these things have to be figured out because we start with the body on or near the river, the Flint River. And in 2003, when this happened, we did have lots of DNA education in terms of what the public
Right.
knew about it, because most of us learned about it from the 95 trial of OJ, right?
Yep.
But compared to where we are now, wasn't DNA kind of in its infancy then?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I would say pre-adolescent
Okay.
because it had been used to great effect in
Sure.
other cases. However, please understand this: when it comes to the sampling that we do now, both at the scene, what we collect at the scene, and also what we can use as a sample, there's a higher probability that back during that period of time, the precious sample that you had could easily be destroyed. Because if it's, for instance, like if it's destructive testing, so you got a one-off chance, so you have to take it in little bits or snips, and so that you have enough remaining. Like if you didn't get a hit in the beginning, and this is how forward thinking that our scientists were, not just in that generation, the early 2000s, but even prior to that. They knew that if they could get a robust enough sample, that maybe technology would eventually catch up, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that's the beauty of where we are right now, because I got to tell you, technology has in fact caught up, but I think probably we still haven't seen the other advances that are going to take place. Right now, we think that we're really in the sweet spot, brother. I got to tell you something. We're nowhere near it, because it's going to become so sensitive, the testing, the ability, everything else. And, in the case of Jeanette, the beauty of this is that they retained enough of a sample that points back to probably who did this. But it also begins telling the tale of what actually happened to her, because I got to tell you, friends, when you hear what was done to this mother and grandmother, it's the stuff of a horror movie. Are you listening? Because the dead are speaking. And in this particular case, what was left behind relative to Jeanette's death it gives us an idea of not just her moments prior to having her life extinguished. I got to tell you, friends, it actually goes to what was done to her in the post-mortem state. And to say that it's depraved, I think, is an understatement. Dave, I don't know that, and it seems like every one of these cases, that we discuss, we're always looking for new adjectives to try to describe. And, the purest one is just evil, as far as I'm concerned.
We keep hitting the bottom with the shovel, and it's like, nope, there's another scoopful. Well, let me just start with the basic. Here's what happened, because from what happened, I'm not hearing the depravity that you're describing. February 22nd, 2003, the body of Jeanette Wilton found near her home in the Flint River, close to a train trestle. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. She had trauma to her head and face. That is the basic police report, acknowledging we have a body. Here's what we see overall. Each one of these things goes deep, though.
Yeah.
What does the autopsy tell us? Actually, when you have a body like this out near a river, what do investigators have to do to keep everything they need to actually get all the evidence collected properly?
It's a massive undertaking with any outdoor scene. The beauty of, if there can be beauty in the sense of working a homicide, of being within a structure, is you've got containment, right? And that's the watchword here. You have containment. We have four walls, right? We have ceiling, we have floor, we have doors, we have windows. But when you get out into an area where you've got a body of water flowing through the area, it's going to be either along the riverbanks, and I can't even begin to tell you the things I've seen along riverbanks over the years when just that have been found as I'm working another case. I've actually been on cases with bodies that were found in the water, and we have actually found other bodies or
While you were working a case?
yeah,
Oh my
yeah,
word.
or remnant of what was left behind. So you never know, in any kind of case, what you're going to come across in an outdoor environment. It doesn't just have to be adjacent to a body of water. It can be a thickly wooded area. It can be actually an area off of a roadway. Think about have you ever driven down an interstate highway and you see like a clump of trees or bushes along the roadway?
Right.
You'd really be surprised what is deposited therein in those locations. And that's in plain sight. I mean, it's obscured by the growth, but just to get off into that area, you can find campsites where people are, have set up a home.
Yep.
They would identify it as a home. Trash, valuables that have been tossed or what had contained valuables like purses, wallets, all those sorts of things, and they've had the valuables taken out of,
Yeah.
and of course bodies too.
I'll tell you this, Joe. I lived in eastern North Carolina on the Pamlico River, right across the river
Yeah,
from Little Washington, North Carolina.
yeah,
I kid you not, one of the worst days was the Monday after after a weekend during the summer,
Yep.
because people just get rid of stuff. I'm telling you, man, we're not kind to our environment.
no,
You and I grew up in the age, remember the Indians, the Native Americans standing on the side of the road, had
Yeah.
the teardrop, well, people
Yeah.
were throwing trash. That's what it's like. Living on a river, that's what it's like every day after a holiday weekend, especially. But you would find so many things out there that you were going, what is this? And I'm thinking that here too, because you know that if you're around the Flint River, you're going to have a lot of waterlogged stuff to be trudging through. I'm
Yes.
guessing you're going to have footprints somewhere. You're going to have prints of something somewhere that's going to lead you back to the suspect here.
Yeah, and you have to, one of the key things relative to an outdoor scene is you have to find a point of ingress so that when you are actually making, or the perpetrator is making their way down to the waterside, where, or riverside, where exactly did they enter this area? Where did they have an opportunity to access? Because listen, this is one thing, and I'm thinking right now about practicality and also common sense. You know that you're not going to have somebody with a human remain thrown over their shoulder kind of marching down the road.
Right.
Oh, look, this looks like a good place to kind of dive into the bushes. I'll make my way down to the riverside and I'll place the body here. That's not what we're talking about. You have to have a place where, if you're in a motor vehicle, which you would assume that they would be, because they're going to have to convey a body that gives you shelter and cover, mobile shelter and cover, then pull over so that nobody's going to pay any attention to you. Look around, get out of the car. Now, where's the body? Is it in the cab of the car, or is it in the trunk? Because both of those scenarios present problems. Also, if you're carrying something that's heavy, any footprints that are collected, now dig this, if it's soft mud, for instance, like the composition of the soil is very, very soft, well, if you walk in, those footprints that are left behind might be deeper if you're carrying something, as opposed to depositing something and turning around and going back to the car, and they might run parallel to one another, but you'd have two sets
Wow.
of prints going both directions. It's also going to change your gait, the way you walk, all these sorts of things. Depth, because the weight that you're bearing your normal body weight, and then you add to that. So the depth, and a lot of that goes to soil composition as well as some of the things that we consider. But when you come across a body that's out there and has been so ravaged and so brutalized, one of the things you have to keep in mind is, are there any instrumentalities of death down there? Because you cannot just assume that she was killed elsewhere and then merely dumped there, okay? Also on the table at this point in time, was she kidnapped, taken out of a motor vehicle, walked down there, and assaulted, and then killed in place, and then left? Those are two different scenarios completely. And if you have an attack that takes place, say, adjacent to the river, because it's a quiet, perhaps shielded area, then you can have scuff marks on the soil where you can actually, and people that are really good at reading footprints can see movement. They can see dynamic movement. Also, I hate to say this, but if there is some kind of attack, if you know what I mean,
Yeah.
You can actually see where knees are contacting the ground. You can see where somebody's backside is trying to fight against this. Just think of the horror that you can just literally interpret from the marks that are left on this surface. And then, of course, you have to think about the trace evidence that's left behind, because there would be blood. And you know how I know that there would be blood, Dave? When I was reading over this autopsy report, Jeanette, and here's something interesting that I don't know that we've had a case like this. We've had people that have had their throats cut, but they're saying in the autopsy report, she was actually stabbed in the throat.
Yeah.
Like repeatedly stabbed in the throat. If these were lethal injuries to her throat with a sharp instrument, I'm not talking about cutting. We've talked about on body bags before with incised weapons that are, you can call it an incision or a cut. It's different than a stab, a penetrative event. So they're saying stab wounds, multiple stab wounds in the neck. Well, there's a high probability that you're going to nick a vessel. Well, what happens when you nick a vessel? Well, you're going to have blood showering everywhere. All right. And it would be all over her. It would be on the ground surrounding her body, maybe leaves, grass, even little twigs that are there. So you have to be very, very careful when you get in there and you begin to observe that location relative to everything else that's in that space.
When investigators show up on the scene, Joe, and they're determining, did this attack take place right here? Because when it's a place like this where the body's found outside near a trestle, it almost seems like the body was dumped. It doesn't seem like this is where the attack took place. But don't you have to treat everything around the body as a possible part of the crime scene?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you cannot be, one of the worst things you can do as an investigator is be arrogant and presumptive. You can't. You have to be, your mind, you have to have the ability to see potential there. I stay away from using the term open-minded. And the reason why is many times when I hear people say you need to be open-minded, many times those people's brains have fallen out of their head long ago because they were so open-minded.
Right.
You have to be open to possibilities, though. That's the most important thing. And to be able to see that and try to interpret it along the way.
Have you ever accidentally trampled on evidence, Joe?
Yes. Yeah. Repeated numbers of times. And sometimes it cannot be avoided, particularly if you're outdoors, right? This goes back to this idea when you have containment within a space.
Right.
Even though I have trampled on evidence inside of a closed space, inside of a dwelling or a structure, yes, that has in fact happened. However, when you get outdoors, you don't have any control over, well, certainly the weather. You don't have any control over the lighting as well. Because, look, friends, do yourself a favor. If you're ever outside and you're taking a nature walk, just see how the light changes when you're walking down a trail. All right. Some places will be highly illuminated, and then you walk through another area, and all of a sudden it's like somebody flipped the switch and you're walking around, not literally in the dark, but it goes to kind of a twilight, And so we're affected by the same things at a scene where the nuance of the lighting itself can compromise your ability to pick up on small little details. You try to go in there with artificial lighting and blast all of the shadows away. And that's not just from a photography standpoint, but that's literally in real-time lighting, where we have lights that are set up. That's one of the reasons you see these big light trucks that the fire department provides many times. We bring our own portable lighting and try to blast that area with light so that we can see where we're stepping. We can also identify evidence. But, like I'll give you, for instance, one of the worst sounds you can ever hear as an investigator. If you have a multiple gunshot related death, one of the worst sounds you'll ever hear in your life is sensing it very lightly on the tip of your boot, and you're in say a parking lot, and you hear that metallic clink as you've just kicked a spent casing and it goes rolling off.
You've done that,
now,
haven't you?
Yes, of course I have. I've stepped on them before. I've ground them into the ground, not knowing that it was there because of poor lighting or my lack of attention. That's why you always have to be on your P's and Q's when you're working on these scenes, Dave.
If I was out there, Joe, I'm so clumsy, I would lose my gig the first day. But in the back of my head, I'm thinking, just to terrorize a new guy on the gig, right? Get a bag of like peanuts, you know, there's in the shell.
Let's don't do that.
Walk behind them, crunching
Don't give
them.
anybody any ideas
what
here.
are
I
you
know
doing?
no,
I imagine
we don't.
you guys had a pretty dark sense of humor as it
Well,
is.
we
you know?
we did, but it all comes down to trying to remain focused on the victim that lay at our feet, because you are in fact trying to tell their story with every little drop of their blood, every little fiber, and certainly in Jeanette's case, every single injury, because I can only imagine the investigators at that moment in time within that environment, they're trying, first off, the first thing they're going to say is, if this was me, who in the world had this much hatred and anger that could be directed at this poor woman? You know, Dave, I just briefly mentioned the stab wounds that Jeanette had sustained in this brutal homicidal attack, but kind of let me run this down to you relative to the injuries that she had sustained. It's important to understand that she was. It's almost as if someone was trying to destroy her and destroy her appearance. Okay, who she was. All right, because think about it. Most people that identify us, I would say, now some of us are identified by our voices, right? But on sight, when you're seeing somebody, you'll say, hey, you know, that's my wife, that's my child, that's my friend. And we're picking up on that, right? Our identity rests here. Dave, in Jeanette's case, she has been so brutalized that her face has literally been pounded over and over and over again. And it's not just her face, it's also her head. These are blunt force. This was a blunt force attack that she sustained. And what they're saying is that much of these injuries, many of these injuries that you have to the face and to the head, many of these fall into the category of being post-mortem.
Really?
Okay. Yeah. So that means that whoever did this to Jeanette did this after the fact.
Okay, now we know that that bruises don't bruise after you're dead. The heart's not pumping blood, right? So that
yes.
What does it look like? How do you know? How can you determine? I mean, if you hit me in the face right now, it would show. And
yeah, it would.
But what about if somebody's already gone?
Yeah, well, in death, what I'm thinking, because they keep using the term blunt force injuries, I'm thinking she probably had lacerations to her face and her head. Laceration arises from blunt force trauma. So if she's pounded like this in the post-mortem sense, if we have the head here, she's struck in the head with either her hand, I'm thinking maybe an object, it's going to lacerate the skin. Laceration is not a cut, it's a tearing that's associated with blunt force trauma. So as the skin is actually torn apart, what you're not going to see in the dead is there will not be any indwelling hemorrhage. Okay. So you're not going to see hemorrhage surrounding these injuries. That's the first indicator to me. Now, she could have sustained some blunt force trauma in the anti-mortem sense, like in order to get her to submit, you know, she's being pounded on in the face and the head. But it's significant to note that enough of these have been identified as post-mortem trauma. Okay. So that leads me to believe that you don't have the tissue reacting in the way that it would react, you know, say for instance in life, because, you know, if you're hit in the face, your eye's going to swell, your cheek's going to swell, it'll turn red. And if you incise that area, you'll actually be able to appreciate where there are little areas of hemorrhage. Well, that only occurs in life. So if you're looking at this from the perspective of what happened in the post-mortem state, I think that's really important. Now, the other thing that we do know, and I briefly touched on this, she's been stabbed in the neck, apparently multiple times. In addition to that, they're also saying she was strangled. So you've got all of this layering that's going on, and this makes this case particularly difficult for forensic pathologists to try to suss out, when they're trying to understand the progression of the injuries.
I know a lot of people want to know, in what order did these things take place in terms of knife stabs in the neck and strangulation? Is there a way that you could legitimately tell based on the wounds?
Yeah. Anytime someone asks regarding progression, or order, that's the term that's used a lot, and you'll hear it in court. What order did these occur in? There's no way. We got two categories: anti-mortem, before death; post-mortem. If you want to throw in there's a state called peri-mortem, P-E-R-I mortem, which means kind of in that twilight and milky zone between life and death. But for our purposes, anti-mortem and post-mortem. And that's really, when you're talking about order, there's really no way to put a finer point on that. I mean, in a perfect world, that would be grand. Like, could we determine what was the progression of a stab wound, right? At what point in this journey towards death was this person stabbed? Where was the first one, the second, third, and fourth, and so forth and so on? That's highly improbable that a forensic pathologist is going to be able to nail that down in the morgue as they're doing their examination. All they can say is that in life, they were, and I'm just throwing out this number, that doesn't mean it comes back to this case. This is an example. She was stabbed in the neck 3 times in life. She was stabbed in the neck 3 times in death, okay? And the way you delineate that is that there's an absence of hemorrhage. The other interesting part to this is they're talking about strangulation. Well, if you're talking about strangulation, if we're thinking about manual, well, really the only way that you could determine that or make a determination time-wise is to say that this is, in fact, an anti-mortem event, because if someone is strangled, I'm talking about manual strangulation as opposed to ligature strangulation, we're going to see focal areas of hemorrhage in the neck. So this stuff, like I had mentioned, it's stratified, relative to the layers that are taking place here. And that's one of the big problems here when you're trying to go into a courtroom and describe these injuries to a jury member, because they want to know. They want to know also, because we know she's sexually assaulted.
Right.
When was she sexually assaulted? Well, that opens up another can of worms at this point in time, not just from the physical sense, but also from the behavioral sense, right? What was the purpose of this person doing this? Is it that they wanted total and complete control over the victim, and therefore they would end their life and then sexually assault in the postmortem state? Or is this something that they wanted to do in life so that, and as we know, sexual assault is not about sex. It's about power, right? And so their power trip with this is to hear her screams, is to feel her moving about, trying to escape and all of that. And that's escalating the situation precipitously here. And so that's important for us to understand as well. But, when the police get there and they're observing all of this, I can only imagine the depth and the breadth. And I would imagine, Dave, like many of the cases we cover on body bags that have, so-called gone cold, which the longer I'm doing this now, I don't really believe in cold cases. I just believe cases that go into stasis kind of. I bet you anything that back then in 2002, these people probably thought they were going to hook somebody up pretty quickly on this.
I think they did think they would, because they started looking like they always do. You start close to home. If you don't have an obvious suspect, you start with those closest to the victim and you work on the victimology and you go out from there. And they came up with nothing, Joe. They came up with nada. And I agree with you anymore. The only term cold case that is good for is that now departments all across the country have a department called the cold case. And because of technology and the way it has grown, there are opportunities now to solve crimes that before would have just been sitting there. And
Yes.
in this particular case, it's funny because when we first started doing this, I thought, okay, you get a little DNA from the crime scene from 20 years ago, you mail it to Texas, and the middlemen's, at Othram, they put it into their little computer, and 20 minutes later, Mr. Peabody spits it out,
Yeah.
and here's
Yeah.
your answer. It's not like that. It takes
No.
so much investigation on the ground in the with the actual case and the case
Yes.
file, and then it's a stair step. It's one step ahead.
Yes,
It
it
takes
is.
a long time. It takes a lot of effort by a lot of different people on both ends working it, because it's like every time you think you're taking a couple of steps further, that has to be investigated. You have to look at all the possibilities there, and it keeps getting bigger and big. It's crazy what goes into it, Joe. But in
Yeah.
this case,
Yeah.
what did they have, and how did they go about getting Othram involved?
Well, they had a case that, actually, credit to Western Michigan University. There's a group of students there that began to work on this case, along with the Michigan State Police, and of course the authorities over in Saginaw, where this actually took place. Listen, it's not a matter that the police and the investigators back in 2002 failed. That doesn't enter into it. And don't come saying that to me.
Right.
All right. They didn't fail. They had to wait for technology to catch up with them, because the public at large thinks that, you can collect something and put it into a machine and it's going to spit out an answer. Those days, that didn't exist back then. And
Right.
even in the sense that you would have CODIS, if a person's not in CODIS, then all you have is a decent sample, and you don't have anything to compare it to. You have to wait for the technology to catch up with it, and to catch up with the sample. And to the credit of the individuals that were working at the scene and working in the morgue that did the biological sampling and the collection of everything, seminal fluid, those sorts of things, that where you can put point-on-point contact, put them at the scene, on the surface of the body, within the body, all those sorts of things. You have to hold on to that, because it's more precious than gold and silver and precious diamonds. Okay. That's how much value it has. And they had to wait. And so in waiting, after they began to put together a profile that would have consisted of a geographic profile, which we've talked about before, it's going to put together a profile of the victim, the victimology, right? And then anybody that's in her associated circle. The way it's done now, though, when you have the science, you can, interestingly enough, if you can get a profile on an individual from the molecule of life, from DNA, right? You can go back and do kind of reverse investigation of the perpetrator. Well, if we've identified this person, what contact? Paint me a picture. Why Jeanette? And does this person have any personal contact with her? What would be the motivation to literally destroy this woman and discard her like she's rubbish, Dave?
I think that because of the damage that was done, and I'm glad you cleared it up, that a lot of the damage to Jeanette was done post-mortem. She was already gone.
Yeah.
That opened a door for investigators to start considering a lot of different things. And once they got the DNA profile, once they got it out to Othram, and they started coming back with possibilities, investigators were able to hone in on a person. And they were looking for somebody that could have a personal attachment to Jeanette because of the way what happened during the attack. And although it's kind of a stretch, the person that they believe did this had been married to one of Jeanette's nieces.
There you go.
So they did have that contact there. There's no idea, because they can't say there was a lot going on in terms of a relationship between the two, but there had to have been something for it to end up the way that it did with what the suspect did to Jeanette. It was just evil.
Yeah. And all it takes for somebody that is twisted, okay, is to merely cast their eyes upon what it is that they're desiring. Okay. In this case, I think it's Jeanette, and obviously. And now we have a name.
Yeah,
Don't we,
buddy.
Dave?
Yes, we
Yeah.
do. Jason Robert Cabello. He's 47 years old now. And Joe, when they brought Jason Cabello into the police department to have a chat with him,
Mm.
they've got the DNA. They know they've got it matched, and he was married to one of Jeanette's nieces, as I mentioned, and they're talking to him 3 different times, giving him the opportunity to say, okay, I did this, or make up a story.
Yeah.
Okay. 3 times he said, no. Mm-mm. And they're like, okay, whoever's DNA is inside Jeanette sexually assaulted her. And it's yours. How did it get there? I don't know. I mean, it really was that ugly that even after all of the evidence is sitting in front of this guy, Joe, he would not cop to it.
Well, I think that there's another peripheral family member that had actually made comments about the subject, in that he allegedly had been making unwanted sexual advances toward them as well within the familial unit. And that can be broad ranging.
Yeah.
When you say familial unit, it doesn't
Right.
necessarily mean that's like your immediate family, but, those that are connected on the periphery. And here's the beauty of it. When you begin to think about Othram and what they do, it doesn't necessarily have to be your father that's pointing the finger.
Right.
It can be a distant cousin. And I think that in this case, this perpetrator who robbed Jeanette of her life, her children of her life, her grandbabies of her life, this person wasn't counting on this. This is back in 2002.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that back then that we would have this ability is mind-blowing to this guy.
Yeah.
Thinking back to what that young forensic investigator would have thought back then would be the possibility today, but it is now a possibility. And here's the most important thing. Othram had a hand in this in the Woodlands, Texas. Our friends, David and Kristen Middleman. There are many of you out there, and I see you at CrimeCon. I see you. I get your messages. They say, hey, I want to do what you did for a living. Well, maybe you do. But many of you want to help. And many of you want to be investigators. You want to lend a hand because you're looking not for closure, because we don't like that word on body bags. We want resolution. We want answers that are rooted in science. You want to know how you can do that? Visit my friends at Othram. Go to DNAsolves.com. Now, when you go there to that website, you can look through all of the open cases. Some might be in your region. You want to give a helping hand. They're not asking for $1 bazillion here, just a couple of bucks pushing it their way, because there's a trigger. When they hit a certain number with any of these cases, they'll flip the switch and they go to work. They have the sample, they begin to process it, and they will give the information to the police, and they can process it just like they did in Jeanette's case. So that's DNAsolves.com. I recommend any of you, my friends out there, please go take a look at this website. Check it out. See what they're doing, because it is mind-blowing. We're in a whole new world, friends. A whole new world. You want to help? You want to help families that have an empty chair at the table? Those wives, those husbands that are quietly weeping every single night, those children that don't have parents any longer because they've been robbed of them? Check them out. Check them out, DNAsolves.com. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bag.